So Donald Trump walked into a press conference and told America the same story he has been telling for 2 years. Canada is cheating. The trade relationship is broken. American workers are the victims, and tariffs are the only language Canada understands. Mark Carney walked into a press conference 4 hours later and took the story apart, piece by piece, number by number, source by source. Not with Canadian data, not with Canadian economists, not with anything that Washington could dismiss as foreign propaganda, with American data, from American agencies, published by the American government. 60%, 98%, 40 million people, $6 trillion, 8 million jobs, every number a fact, every fact a contradiction, every contradiction documented in Washington's own files. The story didn't survive the numbers. Warren Buffett said, "When your argument collapses under your own evidence, you haven't lost a debate, you've lost the room." And then he explained why losing this room costs America something it cannot buy back at any price. But here's what nobody expected. The exposure didn't just end Trump's trade narrative, it handed every American ally on earth a reason to stop trusting American trade claims permanently. When you understand which numbers Carney used, where they came from, and why the White House could not dispute a single one, you'll understand why this isn't about Canada anymore. It never was. Hit subscribe, because the most consequential fact check in modern American trade history just happened, and Washington's own files supplied the evidence. Let me walk you through exactly what happened, because the sequence is the story. For 2 years, Trump has built a trade narrative against Canada on 3 specific pillars, each one repeated at rallies, each one cited in press conferences, each one absorbed by millions of Americans who had every reason to trust the President of the United States when he described their own economy to them. Pillar 1. America runs a massive trade deficit with Canada, hundreds of billions. Canada takes and takes while America gives. The relationship is lopsided in Canada's favor and has been for decades. Pillar 2. Canada hides behind American military protection. American taxpayers defend Canadian sovereignty while Canadian politicians complain about tariffs. Canada contributes almost nothing. Pillar 3. America does not need Canadian energy. America is energy independent. Canadian oil and gas are optional. The dependency, if any dependency exists at all, runs north to south. 3 pillars, each one load-bearing. Remove any one of them, and the entire justification for the tariff policy weakens. Remove all 3, and the policy has no foundation at all. Carney removed all 3. He walked to a podium. He placed 6 charts on a screen behind him. He cited 17 numbers. He named the American government source for every single one, and he invited Washington to dispute any figure it believed was inaccurate. Washington disputed none. By the time the press conference ended, the 3 pillars were gone, and the narrative built on top of them had nowhere left to stand. And here's what nobody was reporting. The most devastating element of what Carney did was not the data. Trade economists have known these numbers for years. The data has been publicly available in government databases that anyone with internet access can search right now. The devastating element was the source attribution. Carney did not cite a Canadian government report. He did not reference a Canadian university study or a Canadian policy institute. He cited the United States Energy Information Administration, the United States Bureau of Economic Analysis, the United States Department of Commerce, the United States Geological Survey, the United States International Trade Commission. He held up each source document as he cited each figure. The agency name was visible. The publication date was visible. The data methodology was documented. There was no room for interpretation, no space for the word propaganda. The numbers came from Washington, and here is what Washington's own numbers said. Canada supplies 60% of all crude oil the United States imports from any foreign country. Not a plurality, not a large share, 60%. The next largest supplier, Mexico, provides approximately 10%. Every other oil exporting nation on Earth combined provides the remaining 30%. The gap between Canada and the rest of the world is not a margin. It is a structural reality built over 50 years of pipeline infrastructure pointed in one direction. Canada supplies 98% of all pipeline natural gas imported into the United States, virtually all of it. The gas that heats homes in Minnesota in January, powers manufacturing in Michigan, and generates electricity across the northern tier of the country flows through Canadian pipelines, with no alternative route at any comparable volume. Canada supplies over 80% of American potash imports. Potash is fertilizer's essential ingredient. Without it, American crop yields do not decline. They collapse. And the only other major global suppliers are Russia and Belarus. In the current geopolitical environment, replacing Canadian potash with Russian potash is not a policy option. It is a confession of strategic failure. Canada provides electricity through physical cable connections to 6 American states. The power lines cross the border and feed directly into American distribution grids. There is no replacement source at any speed. You cannot import hydroelectric power from a country without the relevant rivers. The electrons come from Canada or the lights go out. And the Great Lakes, shared between the two countries under treaties dating to 1909, provide drinking water for 40 million Americans and support $6 trillion in annual economic activity. Carney presented each number without editorializing. He let the figures speak in the silence of the room. And what the figures said was this. Trump told America that Canada needed America. Washington's own data showed America running on Canada. That is not a disagreement between two governments. That is the data contradicting the story. But it gets worse. Because the trade deficit, the foundation of Trump's entire moral argument, the number he has cited more than any other across 2 years of press conferences, does not survive complete accounting. Trump's claim is specific and consistent. America runs a massive trade deficit with Canada, hundreds of billions. The worst arrangement in the history of trade deals. American workers are being systematically drained by a relationship that takes more than it gives. Carney pulled up the actual figure. The goods trade deficit between the United States and Canada is approximately $60 to $80 billion annually, depending on the year and the accounting method used. Real, measurable, but not hundreds of billions, and that is the goods number examined in complete isolation from the rest of the economic relationship. When services are included, and economists include services because services are trade, because American banks and American software companies and American logistics firms and American media companies sell billions of dollars of services to Canadian buyers every year, the picture changes completely. The United States runs a trade surplus with Canada on services of approximately $25 to $30 billion annually. The complete bilateral trade picture, measured the way economists actually measure it, is roughly balanced. And the goods deficit that does exist is driven overwhelmingly by a single category: energy. America imports Canadian oil and gas in volumes that create a visible goods imbalance. But those imports exist not because Canada outcompeted American producers. They exist because American refineries are physically configured to process Canadian heavy crude and have no domestic alternative at comparable volumes or compatible chemistry. Calling energy imports a trade deficit, Carney said, is like calling your heating bill a loss. You are not being exploited. You are purchasing a product your infrastructure requires. The deficit is not a wound. It is a utility payment. But here is what makes this revelation more than a statistical correction. Trump signed USMCA, the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, January 29, 2020. He held a press conference in the Rose Garden. He called it the most important trade deal in the history of our country. He called it his greatest achievement. He said it was a tremendous victory for American workers and American farmers. USMCA eliminated the vast majority of tariffs between the United States and Canada. It created the framework for the integrated North American supply chain Trump now threatens to destroy. It was specifically designed to address the trade imbalances Trump now cites as justification for new tariffs. Carney held up a printed copy of the agreement. The president is describing a problem his own signature was supposed to solve, Carney said. He is citing grievances that his own agreement was designed to address and celebrated as having addressed. He cannot simultaneously call USMCA his greatest trade achievement and describe the relationship it governs as robbery. He set the document on the podium. Either the deal he celebrated did not work, or the problem he is describing does not exist. He cannot have both. Warren Buffett was asked about the trade deficit framing at a business dinner that evening. He set down his glass and was quiet for a moment before responding. In 60 years of investing, the most expensive analytical mistake I have seen, repeated by executives at every level, is confusing a fragment of the ledger for the full picture. A number extracted from one column, stripped of the columns beside it, stripped of the physical and contractual reality underneath it, is not information. It is a fragment, and fragments can be shaped to say almost anything the person presenting them needs them to say. He paused. The goods deficit number Trump keeps citing is a fragment. The complete ledger shows a roughly balanced relationship where the United States purchases Canadian energy because its own refineries require it, and Canada purchases American services because it finds them valuable. That is not exploitation, that is trade, and describing it as robbery requires either a misunderstanding of what the ledger says or a decision not to show the audience the full ledger. The fragment was the argument. The complete ledger ended it. The third layer is the one that cuts deepest, and it has nothing to do with Canada. When Carney placed American data contradicting American government claims on a screen in front of international media, he did not simply expose a flawed trade narrative. He exposed a methodology. He demonstrated with documented, sourced, verifiable evidence that the stated justifications for American trade policy toward its closest ally do not match the data produced by American government agencies. Every trade partner watching that press conference drew an identical conclusion. If the United States misrepresented the economic dependency relationship with Canada, the country it shares a border with, a defense network with, 50 years of pipeline infrastructure with, the most integrated bilateral economic relationship in the Western Hemisphere, what has it misrepresented about trade relationships with everyone else? European trade officials noted publicly within hours that if American tariff justifications are built on premises directly contradicted by American data, no trade agreement with Washington can be taken at face value without independent verification. The European Commission's Trade Directorate issued a formal statement expressing deep concern about the integrity of American trade enforcement mechanisms. Japan's Trade Ministry requested a formal briefing on the data discrepancies. South Korea's Commerce Ministry began conducting independent parallel analysis of American trade claims affecting their own bilateral relationship. India's trade negotiators entered subsequent discussions with verification teams running their own numbers against American official statements. The assumption that American official economic statements were accurate, an assumption that American negotiators had relied on as a strategic advantage in every trade discussion for decades, fractured publicly in a single press conference. And here is what that fracture costs ordinary Americans. The aerospace engineer in Seattle, whose company depends on export contracts with allied governments. Those contracts are negotiated on the assumption that both parties are presenting accurate information in good faith. When allied governments stop accepting American trade data without independent verification, export negotiations become longer, more expensive, more contentious. The engineer's company absorbs that friction in delays and compliance costs that never appear in a tariff announcement. The soybean farmer in Illinois, whose export market access to Asian buyers was built on trade frameworks negotiated across decades of American credibility. When allied governments independently verify American claims before accepting new framework terms, market access negotiations slow. The farmer's export window narrows, not because of a tariff, because trust takes longer to rebuild than it takes to lose. The small manufacturer in Ohio, whose business depends on the rules-based international trading system holding, that system functions on the assumption that its leading member operates honestly within it. When the leading member's own data contradicts its own public statements, the system's authority weakens. The manufacturer's protection from unfair competition weakens with it. These are not abstractions. They are the downstream cost of a credibility loss that Carney did not create. He documented it. The credibility was already gone before he walked to the podium. He made the loss visible to every government watching. Buffett addressed the credibility dimension with the weight of someone who has spent 7 decades watching institutions build and lose the thing that makes everything else possible. In business, credibility is not a soft asset sitting beside the hard assets on the balance sheet. It is the foundation the hard assets rest on. When a company's public statements stop matching its own internal data, the stock price doesn't just fall. Every future statement the company makes is discounted before it lands. Every future projection is questioned before it is read. Every future commitment is valued at less than face value because the market has learned that face value cannot be trusted. He looked up from his hands. What happened today at that press conference is the national equivalent of a company discovering that its public financial statements and its internal data tell 2 different stories. And the discovery was made in front of every investor the company has, and every investor it will ever need. He paused. Rebuilding that takes years. Sometimes it takes a generation. Sometimes the full rebuild never comes. Because markets remember. Markets always remember. The data that contradicted the claims is now on the public record permanently. The gap between what was said and what the numbers show is documented. The silence from Washington, where the counter data should have appeared, is documented alongside it. That gap is not a political problem. That gap is the cost. This is the part that never appears in the press conference. The strategist who constructed the narrative pays nothing. The advisor who repeated the fragments that didn't match the full ledger pays nothing. The official who called the trade relationship robbery while holding the pen that signed the agreement governing it pays nothing. The auto worker in Michigan, whose plant depends on Canadian components crossing the border 6 times during the manufacturing process, pays for every tariff applied at every crossing, not as a policy cost in a trade briefing document, as a job that becomes more expensive to sustain, more vulnerable to relocation, more dependent on political decisions made by people who have never stood on an assembly floor and never will. The dairy farmer in Wisconsin, who was told across 2 presidencies that Canadian dairy tariffs were the reason his farm was failing, pays for the truth arriving after the farm is already gone. His operation did not fail because Canada was cheating. It failed because American dairy policy incentivized overproduction that crashed the price he received for his milk every single year. The scapegoat was visible. The actual cause was never corrected. The family in Vermont, whose heating bill reflects the cost of Canadian natural gas that crosses the border through pipelines built over 5 decades, pays for every percentage point of tariff applied to the energy keeping their house warm, not as an economic policy outcome in a government report, as a dollar amount on a monthly bill that competes directly with groceries and rent and the calculation every working family makes about what gets paid and what gets delayed. The small business owner in a border community who built 30 years of supplier relationships across the line pays for uncertainty that cannot be absorbed or planned around, not for a higher cost with a predictable timeline, for the impossibility of knowing whether the supply chain the business was built on will exist in the same form when the next order needs to be placed. These people did not build the narrative, they funded it. In heating bills and grocery prices and job vulnerability and planning horizons that contracted from years to quarters to the next news cycle. The narrative served the people who constructed it. The exposure serves the people who were told it. And between those 2 groups, the entire distance is the cost. Here is where we stand. Trump built a trade narrative on 3 pillars. Canada is desperate. The deficit is robbery. American energy independence makes Canadian supply optional. Carney walked to a podium with American data from American agencies and removed every pillar in sequence using Washington's own numbers. The narrative is gone. The exposure is documented. The credibility loss extends to every trade relationship the United States maintains with every allied nation that was watching. The people paying for this are not the people who built it. They are the auto worker whose job exists inside a supply chain, the narrative labeled a problem, the dairy farmer whose real problem was given a false cause so the narrative could have a villain, the family in Vermont whose heating bill reflects the cost of a trade relationship placed under deliberate stress, the small business owner whose 30 years of cross-border relationships now carry a question mark where there used to be a foundation. The numbers were always there. American agencies produced them. American scientists measured them. American economists published them. They were sitting in public databases when the first tariff announcement was made. They were there when the second announcement was made. They were there through every press conference and every rally speech and every fragment cited in isolation to build a case that the complete ledger could not support. The narrative chose not to use the complete ledger. And now the complete ledger is on the record, which leaves three questions this story cannot answer. Will the correction travel as far as the original claims, or will the 17 numbers that ended the narrative reach a fraction of the audience that absorbed it across 2 years of repetition? How many allied governments are currently re-examining the factual basis of every American trade claim made to them in the past 2 years, quietly, without announcement, with independent verification teams running the numbers? And the question Buffett raised that should sit with every American long after this news cycle moves on. If the narrative was built on fragments, and the complete picture was always in Washington's own files, and the credibility loss now compounds across every trade relationship America needs, who was the narrative actually protecting? The fragments are gone. The complete picture remains. And complete pictures, unlike narratives, cannot be walked back with a press conference.